There's a thing I've been thinking about for a long time, and I want to say it plainly today without softening it too much, because the softening is part of how we avoid what needs to be looked at directly. The thing is this: I carried grudges for most of my life, not loudly, not dramatically, not in ways that most people around me would have noticed or named as grudges, quietly, internally, in the particular way that a man of my formation carries things, without telling anyone he's carrying them, sometimes without even fully telling himself, but feeling the weight of them every time a name comes up, every time a situation recalls the original injury, every time the world presents an opportunity to be reminded that you're still in a relationship with the person you're choosing not to forgive. I'm 82 years old. My name is Walter, and today I want to talk about 5 people I wish I'd forgiven sooner. Not because they necessarily deserved my forgiveness. Some of them probably did and some of them probably didn't, and the deserve it calculation turns out to be much less important than I thought it was for most of my life. But because the not forgiving was costing me something I didn't understand I was paying until I looked at the accounting from a long enough distance, I want to say one thing before I get into the 5. Forgiveness is not the same as agreement. It is not the same as condoning what was done. It is not the same as pretending the thing didn't happen, or that it didn't hurt, or that the person was right to do it. It doesn't require a conversation. It doesn't require the other person to know you've done it. It doesn't require the relationship to be resumed or repaired, or even continued. What it requires is the willingness to stop organizing a portion of your interior life around a wound that you've been tending, however quietly, and to redirect that energy toward things that are still alive and still yours, and still worth spending yourself on. That's all it is. That's everything it is. The first person I wish I'd forgiven sooner was my father. He died when I was 23. I was told I'd loved him, and I had, and the love was real and specific, and in some ways runs in me still. But there was something else running alongside the love, something I didn't have the language for until I was much older, something that looked like grief when I examined it casually but was, when I examined it honestly, closer to grievance. I was angry at my father. I was angry at him for dying when he did, at the age he did, leaving me at 23 with 4 younger siblings to help look after in a family financial situation that required immediate attention, and no one with the experience to handle it. I was angry at him for the years before he died, for the evenings he was too tired to ask me about my life, for the things he knew about the trade and the world that he never quite got around to passing on. I was angry at him for being 51 and healthy seeming right up until he wasn't, for not having had the decency to warn us that there would be no more time. I was angry at him for 30 years without calling it anger. I called it grief. I called it missing him. I said when people asked about my father, that he died young and it was hard, and I wished he could have met Helen and the children. All of which was true. None of which was the whole truth, which was that underneath the missing him was a low, persistent fury at him for having left me in the position he left me in, at an age when I wasn't equipped for it, without adequate preparation and without the chance to say the things I would have said if I'd known there was urgency. The anger cost me things that I can now see clearly. It cost me the ability to hold him generously in my memory, to see him fully as a person rather than primarily as an absence who had failed me by becoming an absence too soon. It cost me the conversations I should have been able to have about him. With my mother, with my siblings, with Helen. Conversations that got truncated or avoided because the anger underneath the grief made those conversations feel too close to something I wasn't ready to look at. It cost me, I think, some of the relationship with David and Susan, because the particular way I received my father's formation, including the silences and the long hours and the not asking, became part of how I fathered. And I resisted examining it because examining it would have required being honest about the anger first. I forgave my father eventually, not in a single moment, not at a particular age, gradually, over my 60s, in the way that certain understandings come gradually, through accumulation rather than through event. I forgave him when I understood, having been a father myself for decades, how much of what he gave me was the best he had to give. I forgave him when I understood that the not asking and the long hours and the evenings too tired to be present were not choices made against me, but the result of a formation he'd received that didn't include a manual for doing it differently. I forgave him finally when I stood at his grave in Millinocket and said out loud, for the first time, that I'd been angry, and that I understood, and that I loved him anyway, and that the love was in my hands, in the work, in everything I'd built, and that he was in it with me whether I'd acknowledged him there or not. The specific moment at the grave was, I think, the completion of something that had been approaching for years. I'd been getting closer to it through the conversations with Helen in her last years, through the particular quality of honesty that those conversations had, through the slow work of being more honest about what I carried and where it had come from. When I finally stood at that stone and said the words, it wasn't a surprise. It was the arrival of something that had been traveling toward me for a long time. But the arriving still changed something. The visiting the grave had always been a duty before that. After that day, it became something else. A visit to someone I'd finally let be fully who he was. A person who'd loved me incompletely and done his best with what he had and died young and left me to figure out the rest, and who I'd been angry at for 30 years for doing exactly that. After the forgiveness, I could stand at the stone and just miss him. Not miss him and be angry at him. Just miss him. That's what the forgiveness gave me, the clean grief, without the compound interest of the anger that had been riding on top of it for 30 years. I wish I'd done that at 40 instead of at 60. The 30 years in between were 30 years of carrying something that, once set down, I found I barely missed. The weight of it had become so familiar I'd forgotten it was there. The second person I wish I'd forgiven sooner was a man named Gerald. Gerald was Helen's sister Margaret's husband. I've mentioned him in other conversations, and I'll try not to repeat everything I've said before. But I need to say enough to make the forgiveness meaningful. Gerald was, in the most precise sense I can find, a diminishing man, a man who made the people around him smaller by the specific use of his attention, who found the weak point in what you were proud of and pressed on it in a way that was technically polite, but unmistakably hostile. He'd been doing this for as long as I'd known him, which was the entirety of my marriage to Helen, which was 54 years. He'd done it to me, and he'd done it to Margaret, and he'd done it to anyone who had the misfortune of saying something they cared about in his presence. I spent 40 years defending against Gerald, building a wall the width of every holiday table we shared and maintaining it, consciously, from the moment we arrived until the moment we left. I developed a particular alertness around him, a kind of protective tension that I carried into every gathering and released, with something close to relief, when he was no longer in the room. I didn't like the alertness, and I didn't like the tension, and I didn't like what it did to my enjoyment of the occasions that required his presence. But I also didn't question whether the alertness was necessary, because Gerald kept proving, every time I relaxed it, that it was. What I didn't question for 35 of those 40 years was what I was spending on it. The alertness was not free. The wall was not free. The particular quality of vigilance I maintained around a man I didn't like and couldn't avoid cost me something at every gathering. Cost me presence, cost me ease, cost me the ability to be fully there with the people I actually loved who were also in the room. I was never entirely present at those gatherings, because a portion of my attention was always on the Gerald monitoring, and the Gerald monitoring went on for 35 years. I eventually, at about 65, said the thing to Gerald at a Thanksgiving table that I've told before. I asked him plainly not to talk about David's work that way. He went quiet, the gathering was slightly awkward, and something shifted in me that evening that I describe as the end of the wall. Not the end of my knowledge of what Gerald was, but the end of my willingness to organize my interior life around managing him. I put the wall down. I stopped defending. I stopped spending the vigilance energy. And what I found, in the year or two that followed before Gerald died, was that the Gerald problem was considerably smaller without the wall than it had been with it. The wall had been making him a larger presence in my interior than he warranted. Without the wall, he was just an unpleasant man at a holiday table, not the defining condition of every gathering. After Gerald died, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was a small, specific grief for the man he might have been. Margaret told me things, in the years after his death, about his own father, about what he'd received and not received in his formation, about the specific damage that had been done to him long before I'd met him. that had made him the kind of man who could only feel large by making others feel small. I couldn't retrofit compassion onto 40 years of justified grievance, but I could see, from the end, that there had been a person in there somewhere underneath the diminishing, a person who'd also been diminished, differently, earlier, with longer-lasting consequences. I should have been able to see that sooner. It didn't require forgiving what he'd done. It just required seeing him fully, rather than only as the thing he did to me. What I wish I'd done, somewhere in the middle of the 40 years, rather than only at the end of them, was to ask Margaret about Gerald the way I eventually asked about him after his death. Not as intelligence gathering, not to build a case for or against him, but genuinely, who is this man? What made him this way? What is the thing underneath the thing that shows up at holiday tables? Margaret would have told me if I'd asked in the right spirit. She'd known for years what I was only learning from her after he was gone. And the knowing, if I'd had it earlier, might have changed the quality of the 40 years, not eliminated the difficulty, not made me like him or find him easier to be around, but changed what I was defending against. The wall I maintained was defending against Gerald the threat. If I'd understood earlier that he was Gerald the wounded, the wall might have been different, might have been more like the wall you build to keep the cold out, rather than the wall you build to keep an enemy at bay. The cold-keeping wall is still a wall, but it costs less to maintain, and it doesn't organize your interior life around the presence of an enemy. I spent 40 years maintaining the enemy wall when the cold-keeping wall might have been sufficient. That's the cost I wish I'd been able to avoid. The third person I wish I'd forgiven sooner was myself. I know that sounds different from the others. And it is different in the mechanics of it. You can't send yourself a letter, can't have the clearing conversation, can't sit across a table from yourself and say the thing that needs saying. But the not forgiving yourself operates very much like the not forgiving of another person, with similar costs and a similar need for the kind of deliberate release that most people call forgiveness. The thing I most needed to forgive myself for was David's graduation in 1989. I've told this story before. I didn't go. I said it was the job, and the job was real, and the deadline was real. What was also real, and what I didn't admit until 30 years later, was that I was afraid. Afraid of the emotion of the occasion, of not knowing how to be proud in public in the way that other fathers seemed able to be, of saying the wrong thing or being wooden in the way I sometimes was at important moments. I used the job as the explanation, and I let the explanation do the work of the admission I wasn't ready to make. I carried the graduation for 30 years, not in the active front-of-mind way that some injuries are carried, but in the particular way that the things you know you did wrong tend to be carried. At a slight remove, revisited periodically, found worse each time than you'd hoped it would be on closer inspection. I think about David at 22 in Orono, in the crowd, looking for a face that wasn't there. I think about whether he'd told Karen about it, whether he'd told his own children, whether it was something he carried, in his formation of me, in the specific category of things my father didn't do. I didn't know. I was afraid to know. When I finally told him the truth about it, we were sitting on his porch in Portland. I was in my mid-70s, and I just said it plainly. The whole of it, including the fear. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Pop, I know. I figured that out a long time ago." He wasn't angry. He was generous in the way that children are often more generous about their parents' failures than the parents are about their own. And what I felt, sitting on that porch, was not primarily relief at his generosity, though that was there too. What I felt was something that had been locked for 30 years finally releasing. Not because he forgave me, though he did, but because I had finally said the true thing about it, which was the beginning of my being able to forgive myself. The self-forgiveness that followed wasn't automatic, and it wasn't complete, and I'm not sure it will ever be complete, in the way that some things are complete, but it was enough. Enough to stop organizing part of my interior around the wound of the specific choice I'd made in 1989. Enough to let David be David now, rather than always having the 1989 version of him, hovering behind the current one. Enough to be present in our relationship without the particular quality of guilt-colored distance that had been in it for 3 decades. I should have told the truth at 30 years earlier. The 3 decades of carrying were 3 decades I spent avoiding a conversation that took about 10 minutes and produced something that 30 years of carrying had not produced. The fourth person I wish I'd forgiven sooner was my mother. She died in the late 1980s. She'd been sick, the way my father hadn't been. There had been the particular kind of time that terminal illness gives you, both gift and cruelty, enough time to say some things, and not enough time to say all of them. We said what we said. I was there at the end, the way I should have been. The relationship was not unresolved in the dramatic sense, but there was something specific that I hadn't quite addressed, that sat between the acknowledged love and the genuine grief, for the years after she died until I finally looked at it directly. My mother's particular failure, and I use the word failure knowing it's a hard word and meaning to use it anyway because the softening is how I avoided the looking at it for so long, was that she did not protect me adequately in the 4 years between my father's death and her own, from what I was expected to carry. When my father died and I became, by default, the person the family organized around, she let me carry more than a 23-year-old should have been asked to carry. Not cruelly, she wasn't a cruel woman. She was a grieving widow doing her best with what she had. But the best she had included allowing me to become the adult of the family at 23, without ever quite asking me whether I could bear it, without ever quite acknowledging the weight of what she'd passed to me, without ever quite saying the thing that would have been the most useful and the most honest, which was, "Walter, I know this is too much for you. I'm sorry. You didn't choose this. I wish it were different." She didn't say that. And I needed her to say it, and she didn't. And the not saying of it lodged somewhere in me in the way that needed things that don't come tend to lodge. Quietly, stubbornly, available to be felt at odd moments for decades. I forgave her eventually, by understanding 2 things. The first was that she was in her own grief, enormous and disorienting, and the grief made her less able to see what the adult making of me was costing me, because she was consumed by what the loss of my father was costing her. The second was that the role I'd stepped into, the role she'd let me step into without quite seeing the cost of it, had also given me things that the easier version of my early 20s wouldn't have given me. It had given me an early relationship with responsibility that made me a certain kind of person. It had given me the knowledge that I could handle things, that the crisis didn't destroy me, that I had resources I wouldn't have known about if I hadn't needed to discover them. Those were not nothing. They were, in many ways, central to who I became. The forgiveness, when it came, was understanding her completely, understanding the grief and the limitation and the doing her best, without requiring her to have been more than she was. She was what she was. She gave what she had. What she had in those years was not unlimited. The forgiveness was letting her off the hook I'd been keeping her on, acknowledging the cost without requiring her ghost to pay it. What I want to add to this, because I think it's important, is that the not forgiving my mother had a specific downstream cost that took me many years to see clearly. The thing I'd needed from her, the acknowledgement of what had been asked of me, the seeing of the cost, the "I know this is too much and I'm sorry." That thing, undelivered, became something I looked for in other forms and other places for decades. I looked for it from Helen, who was not equipped and not positioned to provide it the way a mother could have. I looked for it from the work, which can't acknowledge anything because it's wood and not a person. I looked for it in the quality of my own competence, telling myself through every difficult thing I handled that this proved the 23-year-old had been up to it, that it had been right to ask, that the asking hadn't been too much. None of those substitutes provided what the undelivered thing from my mother actually was, and so I kept looking in various forms without quite knowing what I was looking for. The forgiveness of her allowed me to stop looking, to acknowledge that the thing I needed was never going to arrive from the source I'd originally needed it from, and that the not arriving didn't change the validity of having needed it, and that I could grieve the need without sustaining the grievance against the person who couldn't meet it. That is what the forgiveness actually was in the end. The distinction between the legitimate need and the person who couldn't meet it, and the letting go of the claim against the person while keeping the acknowledgement of the need. The fifth person I wish I'd forgiven sooner is the one I find hardest to talk about, because it requires admitting something about a period of my life that I've been reluctant to examine directly. The fifth person is Helen. I loved Helen for 54 years. I love her still, in whatever form love continues when the person is gone. There is no question about the love. And there is also no question, if I'm being honest in the way this conversation requires honesty, that there were things about Helen that I was angry at her for, that I was holding against her in the quiet, unspoken way that the grievances that can't be named tend to be held, for years. What I was angry at her for is hard to say plainly, because it sounds small when I put it into words. And in another sense, it wasn't small at all. I was angry at her for being right. Not about everything, not about most things, but about the specific important things that she'd been saying for years, that I'd been half hearing and redirecting and not quite letting land. She'd been saying in various forms, and with various degrees of directness, that I was not fully present, that the work had too much of me, that the children, when they were young, had gotten a version of me that was adequate, but not full, that there were years when she felt alone in the marriage despite my physical presence in the house. She'd been saying all of this, and I'd been managing it, deflecting it, offering the partial concession that didn't quite acknowledge the full truth of what she was seeing. And she'd been right. I knew she'd been right. And the knowing she was right while being unable to change as fast as the knowing required created a particular kind of resentment that I wasn't proud of and didn't examine cleanly for years. The resentment at the person who is right about you is one of the stranger and less dignified emotions a person can carry. And I carried it quietly, in the background of what was otherwise a genuine and deep love, for years. I was angry at her for being able to see what I couldn't make myself change fast enough, for reflecting back to me a version of myself I wanted to be, but wasn't yet, for the gentle, persistent accuracy of her attention to what was actually happening rather than to the story I was telling myself about what was happening. What the not forgiving her cost us was a certain kind of full closeness that we spent years approaching and finally found in her last decade. The closeness in those last years was partly the completion of the building we'd been doing all along, the depth that a long marriage builds slowly, but it was also partly the product of my having finally let go of the resentment at her rightness, having finally been able to acknowledge without qualification that she'd been seeing clearly, and I'd been the one in the fog. When I stopped being angry at her for the accuracy of her seeing, there was more room between us, more room for the love that had always been there to be what it actually was without the slight defensive tightening that the resentment had maintained. I forgave her, finally and fully, after she died, which is the saddest part of this particular forgiveness, because she wasn't there to know it and I wasn't able to tell her. What I could do, and what I did, was talk to her about it, in the way I still talk to her, in the way that might seem strange to people who haven't needed it, but that makes sense to anyone who's loved someone that long and lost them and found that the losing didn't end the relationship, just changed its form. I told her, out loud, alone in the house, that I'd been angry at her and that I understood it, and that the anger had been the small, frightened version of me responding to the large seeing of her, and that I was sorry it had taken the form it took, and that the thing she'd been saying was true, and I knew it had been true, and the truth of it was in everything I'd changed, and everything I was still changing. I wish I'd told her that while she was alive. I wish I'd gotten to the forgiveness while she was still in the room to receive it. What I have instead is the talking to the air, and the conviction that something in the saying is still real, even without a person present to hear it. I have that, and I have the last decade of the marriage, which was the closest we ever were, which was the product of the partial forgiveness I'd managed by then, and which tells me that full forgiveness would have produced something even better if I'd gotten there earlier. Here's what I mean by that, specifically. In the last decade of our marriage, her 60s, my late 60s, and into my 70s, we had a quality of being with each other that we hadn't had in the same form in any of the earlier decades. We were more honest. We were more willing to say the difficult thing directly rather than managing it. The particular defensive tightening that the resentment had maintained, the slight withholding, the half-presence, the careful management of what I let her see, was mostly gone by then, and what was in its place was a kind of ease that I associate entirely with that last decade, and that I've missed enormously since she died. I believe that ease was available earlier than it arrived. I believe that if I'd found my way to the full honesty of the forgiveness sooner, if I'd been able to say earlier that I'd been angry at her for being right, and that the anger was the small, frightened version of me and that I was sorry for it. The ease might have arrived in our 50s rather than our 60s. We might have had 20 years of it rather than 10. And 20 years of that ease, of that full closeness, of that specific quality of being known and being allowed to know. That's what the not forgiving sooner actually cost. Not the relationship, which survived, which was good in all its decades in different ways, but a decade of that particular quality of closeness that was the best thing we had between us. I spent that decade in the management instead. I wish I'd spent it in the ease. The fires burned down to very low coals. The morning is gone. Outside, the November light is the particular flat gray that doesn't demand anything from you, that just sits there being the end of the year, patient and honest. I've been in this chair for a long time, longer than I usually sit here, because what I was saying today required the sitting. 5 people, 2 of them dead before the forgiveness fully arrived. One of them, Gerald, whose forgiveness I don't think was his to receive but mine to give. And I gave it finally, not to him but to myself, by stopping the organization of my interior around the wound he'd given it. One of them, my son, who turned out to be more forgiving of me than I'd been of myself, and who was waiting with the generosity I couldn't see until I finally walked toward it. And one of them, Helen, the one who deserved the forgiveness most and received it least while she was alive, and who receives it now in the imperfect ongoing form of a conversation I keep having with the empty room. What I've learned sitting in this chair is that forgiveness is primarily a decision about where your energy goes, not a feeling. The feeling may or may not follow the decision, and often arrives late and incomplete. A decision, the decision to stop spending your interior life in relationship to a wound, to stop tending the grievance the way you'd tend a fire you actually wanted to keep burning, and to redirect what had been going into the tending towards something that is still alive and still yours, and still worth spending yourself on. The decision is yours to make regardless of whether the other person knows or cares, or has done anything to earn it. The decision is made for your own sake in your own interior, by yourself, and the making of it, the actual making, not the thinking about making, not the deciding to decide. The making of it is one of the most useful things you can do with whatever years you have left. I made these decisions too late for some of what was spent to be recovered. My father never knew I was angry, or knew I'd forgiven the anger. Gerald never knew I saw his damage as well as his wounding. David waited 30 years for a conversation that took 10 minutes. My mother went without the specific acknowledgement that would have cleared something between us. And Helen received, in life, an incomplete version of what I managed to complete only after her death. Those are the costs. They're real. The forgiveness doesn't erase them, but the forgiveness changed something in the time I have left. Made it lighter. Made it more mine. Gave me back a portion of my interior that had been going toward the tending of these 5 wounds for decades, and let me use that portion for the things that are still here and still worth spending on. The grandchildren, the Sunday calls, the shop in the morning, the fire in the evening, the green cup she bought at the fair in Bar Harbor in 1989, still on the table, still worth the looking at, still holding the coffee that starts the day. That's enough. At 82, that's more than enough. If anything I said today reached you, you can subscribe to walk with me a while longer. I read every comment. Tell me about the person you've been carrying too long. Tell me what the carrying has cost you, and tell me, if you're willing, whether there's any of it you've managed to set down. I'd like to know. Take care of yourself. Put the wall down. Say the true thing. You don't have to carry it all the way to the end. And if there's someone you've been carrying who is still alive, who can still receive the thing you've been withholding, consider saying it this week. Not dramatically, not as a production, just as the truth. I know I've been holding this. I'm choosing to set it down. Whatever form those words take in your particular situation, say them. The other person may or may not receive them well. That's not the point. The point is the decision you're making about your own interior. That decision is yours. Make it. The fire's still going. I'll see you next time.